woman discovers how to raise sinless children. Plus, are Bible literacy classes coming to your local school? I'm Joel Kurtnitis.
And I'm Josh Hugo.
And you're listening to Constructive Interference. So, here at Constructive Interference, we cover a lot of things. Some days we get into politics. Well, okay, most days we get into politics at some point. But sometimes we discuss culture, and sometimes we're talking about entertainment or gaming or tech. And if you've been listening to us for any amount of time, you've probably heard a lot of that. But you also hear us tie faith in at different points, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So one, we're both Christians, or at least, I assume Josh is too. We've talked about it before. He says he is. So, and faith informs our judgment and discernment on pretty much everything. And then second, just to be honest, with our worldviews, it's very important that we tell our worldview and be honest about it in order to have a meaningful discussion about anything. Now, Christianity, or even just monotheism more broadly, it produces a particular worldview, and it's just this set of beliefs and assumptions that we use to interpret the world around us. And I know that's true for me. Josh, is that kind of true for you too?
Well, it's true for everybody, really. Everybody has some...
I'm speaking specifically about Christianity in this case, so maybe a little more specifically.
Yes, Joel, that's true for me. Thank you for the vote of confidence.
Well, yeah, I'm taking you at your word,
Yes.
One day you may prove me wrong on that, but no, I take that back. We don't want to get into eternal security this episode. However, if you're a theology nerd, you'll appreciate that one. So, if you're a fellow Christian,
let's never do that. Let's never go to that exact spot.
Oh,
please.
Eternal security. Well, yeah, that could end poorly, I guess. Or at least if we are going to, let's do it before we get guests, right?
Yes. Yeah. I can't see how that would end up being fun for anyone. So.
Yes,
anyway.
Indeed. We have to form our own little constructive interference list. Who's going to hell this week? No. So, no, that was a joke.
That'll get people to listen. Yeah, threaten them with that.
Oh dear. No, so if you're listening to us and you are a fellow Christian, awesome. Thanks for joining, and hopefully you will find some encouragement and agreement in some of the things that we talk about. But if you're a skeptic, or an atheist or an agnostic, and you don't really consider yourself a religious person, then we are even more glad you joined. Because this is an opportunity for us to discuss faith in America and why it's important, and some of the decision making that's going on right now, and how it ties into faith and religion in America. And I think that's something that should matter to you whether you believe in God or not, because it affects all of us every day. Our story today starts, well, like most of them recently, with a Trump tweet. Ta-da! So Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, which still is just so funny every time I have to say that phrase.
I laugh out loud sometimes when I think about President Donald Trump. Yes.
I can't get through the phrase with a straight face half the time. It's this best timeline, But he tweeted out I want to say controversial, but that's just sort of understood, isn't it? Like, at this point, do you really have to say that a Trump tweet is controversial, or do you just say he tweeted and you understand that it's controversial? Anyway, so there's a Hill article I'll link to in the show notes. Started out by saying, President Trump on Monday embraced proposals from lawmakers in 6 different states that would allow public schools to offer Bible literacy classes. I'm sure most of you can hear the shrieks already. The president's tweet came shortly after the subject was discussed on Fox and Friends. Numerous states, this is a quote of the tweet, numerous states introducing Bible literacy classes, giving students the option of studying the Bible. Starting to make a turn back? Great, Trump wrote on Twitter. So 6 states now introducing Bible literacy classes. And it's important to note that these are elective, right? Nobody is sitting there with a whip standing over them saying, you must memorize the book of John or you're going to be flogged. That's really not what anyone is talking about here. But what we do know is that there's been lawmakers in 6 states proposed elective Bible literacy courses, that Trump is apparently supportive of this, and immediately the critics jumped on board with separation of church and state! Separation! So, yeah, so first of all, Josh, what do you think about the separation of church and state? Do you think this is a valid criticism of it?
Well, for this specific topic, that seems especially silly because we're talking about literacy. Now, even if you don't believe that the Bible is anything special, even if you think it's fiction, fairy tales, whatever, it's obviously a very important book in Western civilization and in history.
Oh,
it's
doubtless.
a book. Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about a single book that has shaped history, that's obviously going to be the Bible. You know, you can't talk about history without talking about the Bible, the Quran, and probably the Communist Manifesto.
Well, sure, at least not Western history, right?
Right.
I mean, there's this Western Civ courses that, recently a congressman in my state got in trouble for bringing up as Western civilization was sort of deemed controversial up here. But I took a Western Civ class, right? And the Bible, you could not have gotten through that without the Bible, because so many of the advances that have occurred in Europe and the United States and North America has been due to the Bible, directly or indirectly. I mean, it's influenced language and culture and architecture and law and art and pretty much everything.
Well, it's the lens. To understand a culture, you have to understand how that culture thinks and what it values. And the Bible has been, I'll say for better or worse, because some people would think it was for the worse, but whatever your opinion is, the Bible has been the lens through which the West understands the world. And you can't understand Western culture, Western civilization without understanding something about the Bible. So simply for reasons of historical knowledge and literacy, it should not be controversial to have a Bible literacy class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't think so. And I need to go on a little tangent on separation of church and state. Okay, I absolutely do not want a state religion. Okay, that's part of the reason that the founders came over here in the first place, is they were being persecuted for religious reasons. I do not want Congress, creating a United States religion and then dictating how it needs to be observed. That is the intent of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law respecting religion, okay? The establishment of religion and the free exercise thereof. That's not really the separation of church and state as it's talked about by critics today, who kind of go nuts about policies like this. And what they're talking about is actually not in the Constitution at all. It's typically referring to a letter from Thomas Jefferson to a couple of ministers who were worried about exactly that, who were worried that the federal government would get involved in religion and would start to dictate to churches what they could and could not do. And he wrote to them basically saying that the First Amendment was building a wall of separation between church and state for the purpose of protecting the church from the state. Not vice versa. And it's always interesting to me to note, the same people that, it's claimed put together this constitution that prohibited any form of religious expression in government also instituted daily congressional prayer. So I don't know.
Right.
Anyway, you'll have to figure that one out on your own, people.
Well, it's important to remember historically that many states actually did have state churches. There was the Church of England was, of course, the Church of England. That was actually founded by the king and administered by the state. And of course, the Catholic Church was the church that was officially recognized by many countries at the time. And many countries had their own Protestant denominations that were officially recognized too. So
right.
When Thomas Jefferson talks about the separation of church and state, he's talking about that sort of official linkage, that sort of official sponsorship or patronage of a specific church by the state. He's not talking about this idea that the state should be completely free from any influence of any religion at all, which is what it's been interpreted as.
And it's really interesting. I had not thought of it until you just talked about the Church of England and its background. But the Church of England actually broke away when the king decided he did not want the Pope telling him what to do in terms of his marriage habits. And it's really interesting because we're going to get into something similar later on in the discussion today. But first, why the reaction? Why this strong negative reaction to the proposal that the Bible should be offered as an elective course? Bible literacy should be offered as an elective course in public schools. Why are people reacting so harshly against that?
Well, like I said, people have interpreted that separation of church and state as being this idea that the state has to somehow be completely free from any religious influence. And
well, that's the how, but is that really the why, though? I mean, as far as motives go, like I can imagine saying that, well, the government shouldn't have the right to, tax my property, for instance. Not that that would be controversial, but I can imagine having a reaction to that, but not, getting this visceral sort of, how dare you? I don't know. Is there a motive? Is there a motive here? Is this like personally trampling on anyone's rights?
Well, I think this article that we're about to discuss here by Julie, how do I pronounce his name? Julie Shearies, in the New York Times really touches on that. I think basically there are a lot of people who have this really negative, I think is oftentimes a personally negative connotation associated with the word religion and a very limited view of what it means. And I think that is probably the source of a lot of the animosity that we see towards it.
So the next question I think that would have to come is, if the Bible really does have that much influence on Western civilization, on Western history, do you think it still has that sort of influence in America? I mean, obviously, traditional, what you might call Judeo-Christian ethics have been waning for a while, and I know both of us have grown up during the period where evangelicals have been hand-wringing about that for a couple of decades at least. But if that influence is waning right now, is it really the fault of school curricula? And is this likely to give Christianity a comeback in the West?
Oh, I wouldn't think so. I mean, face it, if kids are going to public school to learn about Christianity, then it must not be an important thing in their own homes. If if kids have to go to the public school to learn about the Bible, then that means that the Bible must not be important in their homes. And I would think that would probably give the atheists and the people who are antagonistic to Christianity some comfort to think that these kids are so ignorant of the Bible and it's so irrelevant in their lives that they aren't going to know about it unless they take an elective in public school. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I were an atheist, I would be like, oh, that shows that I'm on the ascendancy here. That shows that I'm winning.
Mm-hmm. Well, and historically, the churches have been involved in education for a long time before public schooling became a thing, right? Like the churches were actually responsible for education a lot of times in Western history. So there's been a connection there at different points where the church has tried to kind of keep that candle lit. And in fairness, Islam has actually done the same thing at different times. They were responsible for the first universities and whatnot. So their faith and education have been tied for a long time in Western history. But honestly, I think it has less to do with. I mean, obviously, the whole kicking God out of schools and everything. It's hard to imagine, especially if you look at the statistics on violent crime and teen pregnancies and divorce rates, everything else, that after we removed God from schools, that there was a dramatic societal impact. I mean, it's hard to argue that. But at the same time, I don't really blame. I mean, like you're saying, I mean that immersion in faith culture, it can't be an elective course. That really doesn't cut it. And I wonder if the decline of the U.S. away from that is more the result of the relegation of Christian faith to like cutesy Hallmark card stuff, because that's what it seems like to me. Is like there's not that gravity to faith anymore, and so there's very little attraction for at least a certain demographic.
Well, it seems to me that in the past, you talked about these people coming over from Europe, from England to escape religious persecution, and in the past, religious was really central to life for most people, certainly for the early Americans, and I'm not sure exactly when it happened, but it seems to me that sometime in the fairly recent past, religion was relegated to being more of an accessory to being American. And I think, in my mind at least, that seems like the root of the decline that you're discussing here.
Well, we have definitely gone over the stats on that before, the high percentage of Americans who believe in God in some vague sense, but then when you start to get into specifics, that number kind of goes off a cliff. And I think part of it has also been that just the notion of faith has kind of been misconstrued.
For sure.
When I hear people talk about faith, they're talking about it, and again, to hark back to prior episodes here, we rip on Christian movies a lot, but one of the things that Christian movies have the worst time with is the word faith, in my opinion. I mean, when you hear faith mentioned in a Kirk Cameron movie, it's going to be, you just have to have a good feeling about something and then step up to that cliff and jump right off of it. Well, okay, that's not, it's not exactly that scenario, right? I mean, we're not going for the Indiana Jones leap of faith there. That's not what faith is, right? Faith is not blind. And there are a lot of brilliant Christian thinkers who would emphasize this. Faith is the result, at least in my opinion, it's the result of a critical and often intellectually demanding process that includes wrestling with probabilities and calculating risk and determining what's true and what's not true. Evaluating character and evaluating history. Like, all of these things go into producing faith. If you just place blind faith in things because it feels like it, you're not being faithful. You're being a fool.
Oh yeah, I mean, the word faith has been so completely ruined. I guess I'll say ruined in our language. People nowadays think that if you have faith in something, faith means believing without evidence, and that's basically the impression people have. It's like you just have faith in something, like you believe in Santa Claus, and that's faith because there's no proof, but you believe it. But that's not at all what the word faith means. I mean, the word faith comes from the Latin fidelis, which is where we get our word fidelity. And that's why we talk about a faithful spouse or a faithful partner. Faith has to do with the durability, the endurance, the conviction of a belief, not with whether or not there's evidence for it. You can have faith that is well-founded, or you can have faith that is misplaced. Faith has nothing to do with why you believe, or even specifically what you believe. Faith has to do with your sincerity and the durability of your belief. And I think that's something that's really, really been lost in our language and our culture, sadly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would argue that there is such a thing as non-religious faith as well. I mean, I think that even outside of the realm of the philosophical, faith is what you end up with when you keep asking why until you reach the limits of human knowledge. And those limits are not really as deep as we'd like to think they are. I mean, you can really, and this is like a business endeavor, right? You just keep the 6 levels of why or whatever, you just keep asking why until you get to a foundation of some sort. And we do this scientifically all the time. I mean, we break things down to molecules and atoms and quarks, and I mean, we just keep going all the way down. But an incomplete understanding of those, atomic forces that are holding the physical world around us together doesn't stop me from sitting down in a chair. And that's kind of the classic argument around faith, right? Is that I have faith in the things that I interact with every day, without having a complete understanding or knowledge of how they work or why they work or what holds them together, or really, waking up in the morning and coping with the fact that the spoonful of cereal that I'm putting in my mouth is full of, billions and trillions of subatomic particles that are all moving at near light speeds, Because all of these things would put a dent in your faith if you thought about them for long enough. But that's why I say, I think we have cheapened the concept so much that, I don't think we really connect faith to the rest of life. And that's why, when I talk about how faith informs our judgment and our decision making, that's why it's so important to this whole process. Is I don't think it's divorced and put in this sort of religious box on the side. I think this is actually key to understanding and going through life.
Oh yeah, it's key to understanding going through any aspect of life. It's like if you don't have faith in anything, that paralyzes you. You don't have any ability to act if you don't trust that there are certain truths that will not change as you go about your daily activities. Like you mentioned, sitting in a chair. It's like if I don't continue to believe that the chair will hold me from moment to moment, well, I'm not going to be able to sit.
Right.
Even something that basic requires faith. Mm-hmm. Which is, I guess, why I think this idea that we have nowadays of separation of church and state, where the state can't have any sort of religious influence, is really absurd, because no matter how secular you want the state to be, it still has to be founded on some sort of belief, on some sort of idea of universal truths that are true for everybody. And if you don't have that, then how can you have a state at all?
Well, right, and that question of what's right and wrong, and what are the limits of human responsibility and authority, all of those things come down to, I believe, fundamentally whether you believe in God. I mean, that sounds like such a simplistic way to put it, but if you follow the pattern of asking why all the way down and continuing to ask why, you will eventually come down to the question of whether you believe in God. That's really that's what dictates almost everything else that you can think about from a philosophical or a moral standpoint, or even just epistemological. You're going to what you hold to be true and what you hold to be valuable will ultimately come down to whether you believe there's God or not. And if so, then, what manner of God that is. And you can phrase that however you want. You want to call it God, you want to call it a first cause, you want to call it, whatever spin you want to put on it. That's the question that dictates how much of your worldview is you're going to apply in a given situation and what that worldview is going to look like. Now, I don't think there's a more defining question that you can ask than that, because of some of the if-then propositions that sort of precede, that sort of surround that question of whether there's a God. And one of them goes like this: if God exists, then does objective morality also exist as defined by God? Like, would that be a good premise to draw from that? Or, as some people have phrased it, if there is a moral law that we can observe, doesn't that mean there has to be a moral law giver?
Well, like you said, it's important to make the distinction, though, that a moral lawgiver doesn't have to necessarily be a person. It has to be some sort of universal principle that applies to everybody. Mm-hmm. And again, we're talking about God in this particular context, in a philosophical context. We're talking about more of that first cause or that universal truth than specifically about the God of the Bible. But
right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the question applies equally, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so then that would be one of the, the objective morality question would be one of the foundational assumptions of Christianity, if you do believe in the God of the Bible, that just like God would be the original force according to the Bible that created all the physical stuff in the universe, and all of the the energy and the matter, if you will, it would make sense that he also would have determined moral laws that govern relationships and interactions, a lot like physics, right? The relationships and interactions between particles and time and energy, those are all governed by fixed laws. And at least until you get into the quantum realm, then things get really weird. but there are fixed relationships that we can quantify in mathematical terms and scientific terms. And a lot of those things we've observed in a similar way, through human history, in relationships and in actions and reactions and in morality. And so now you've got kind of an interesting question, though, because if you remove God from the equation of morality, then what determines it? What are you left with? And this is something that atheists have actually struggled with for a while, and I would say some honest atheists have actually admitted it. And then we have people who have just decided to make it up as they go. And that brings us to the article that you were referencing earlier by Julia Shiras, I hope I'm saying that right, who penned an article for the New York Times titled "Raising Children Without the Concept of Sin." That's a title that I really could not just scroll past, honestly. When I saw that one come by, I'm like, okay, I really need to read this one. And the link will be in the show notes, but sort of to nutshell this, she talks about how she was raised in a strict Christian household, and everything, the concept of sin was very fearful and hurtful, and was kind of felt like there was a hammer hanging over her head the whole time. And as somebody who was raised in a Christian household, I get that. Like I understand the relationship there of sin and righteousness and the concepts by which Christianity deals with those notions. But it does. I will say, if you read the article, feel free to have a different take on it and let us know in the comments. But I felt like there's definitely some history there that put a little bit of a slant on her worldview. Anyway, so then she is talking about how in her relationship with her kids have grown up not understanding what sin is, because as an adult she's moved away from that concept, moved away from the way that she was brought up, and has raised her kids without a concept. And then the day came where one of her children asked her, "What is sin?" And I'm going to skip closer to the end of the article here. She says that, this is the author says, "Although I no longer have contact with my parents and live a very different life, we do have this in common. Just as my parents' approach to imparting their values was shaped by an effort to avoid the sins they feared, I am raising my two daughters according to my moral code. To me, the greatest sin of all is failing to be an engaged citizen of the world, so the lessons are about being open to others rather than closed off." And then she goes on to sort of quantify that with what her kids are doing, their political activism, and they get on marches, and they get in marches, and then they help people as they have the opportunity to. And then a couple of the closing paragraphs read like this: "As we stood in line a few weeks ago at the Dickens Fair, I realized that my kids already knew what sin was without ever having been exposed to the onerous religious weight of the world. Despite being unchurched, they are empathetic, loving, and kind, and even more, they are fearless. I gazed into my child's upturned face and felt a rush of love and happiness. I had raised her without sin."
What?
Full stop. Full stop. So, how to raise a sinless child. If you've ever wondered, if you're a mom or a dad out there and has to bang your head against the wall because your kid won't do what they're told, or they are constantly getting into trouble, or you have a problem with toxic masculinity in your household and they can't stop beating people up. Sorry, Gillette. This is the solution. We have it right here. Just don't tell them what sin is, and then they'll be perfect. Is that what you take from this, Josh Hugo?
Well, yeah, more or less, but I'm just kind of blown away by the fact that she's saying in that paragraph and in the title of her article that she raised her kids without sin, but at the same time is saying that she's taught them what sin is, and that sin is being closed to other people and lacking empathy. So
yeah, kind of funny how that works, huh?
Wait, which is it? Did you raise them without sin, or did you teach them that sin is lacking empathy? It seems like you can't have it both ways there.
Yeah, I felt like the premise of this was kind of too clever by half, right? Like I have figured out I have raised my child without sin, but I've sort of laid out my own moral code that, in breaking away from what all these stupid people before me and their dumb churches thought, I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to come up with it myself. I'm just gonna sit here and spin a game wheel and see what comes up, and that'll be good and bad for me.
I feel like she did the same thing with the word sin that we talked about being done with the word faith earlier. It's like we've redefined faith instead of meaning a durable and sincere belief. We've redefined faith as meaning a belief without evidence. Well, all she's done here is instead of defining sin as that which is objectively wrong for all people, which is what the word originally means, she's redefined it to mean a very narrow, specific set of guilt-based no-nos that her parents gave her, and that's what sin is.
Well, yeah, and I don't know Julia. She might be a really nice person, but my question on this is, why should anyone? The problem with it, as you mentioned, is if this is personal set of standards, why should anyone care or listen to it at all? Where's the impact outside of your own person?
Well, I feel like I'm sorry. I feel like she's saying that lacking empathy is sin. It's like that everybody should have empathy and everybody should be open to other people. And if anybody's not open and empathetic, then they're doing it wrong. So I feel like she's established her own objective moral standard here.
But that's the downfall of moral relativism, right? That's why it's actually collapsing under its own weight right now, and the rise, with the rise of the authoritarian left, if you want to call them that, and the social justice crowd, because that's actually based on the premise that no, subjective morality doesn't work, which is why it's not okay to be tolerant of Nazis in Charlottesville. It's actually the rise of the authoritarian social justice crowd is actually predicated on the collapse of moral relativism. You can't have both of those things in the same space at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. You have to pick one. And I feel like this article is sort of a last gasp of 90s moral relativists. And I don't know her, but I would feel like there would definitely be some elements of that in here that have this assumption that, okay, well, I can just say this is what my personal value system is, and I can live that way, and then that's fine, right? That works as long as you don't interact with anyone else ever. But the problem is, if my personal morality system is different than yours, we don't have a basis on which to even communicate about those things, right? It's like the question of one culture says love your neighbor, another culture says eat your neighbor. Are those two things morally the same? I don't see how even if you argued that they were morally the same, could those two societies coexist? Not really. Not in the same place.
Well, no, that's why you need an idea of sin, because like I said, sin is the thing that's wrong for everybody. So unless you have that idea of sin that two groups share, well, no, they can't even talk to each other. They can't interact because they have completely different ideas of what is right and wrong. Mm-hmm. So you've got to have sin. You've got to have an idea of sin to even interact with people on a moral level.
Right, and there's so much that can't even be accomplished unless you have, and I think this kind of speaks to where America's societal communication is breaking down right now, is we don't have these universal concepts anymore that we can all agree on from which to draw moral conclusions. And therefore, you've got basically a couple of tribes forming up and just saying the other side is the devil because I want them to be, which is just not a very logical basis, honestly. But when I read something like this, I'm just struck with the arrogance of the premise that we just get to individually define what's right and wrong, and And that just works. That we can just bend the laws of the universe to our will. And it reminds me of a line from Friedrich Nietzsche's Story of the Madman, which, in all honesty, I would not be familiar with if I had not been a fan of Ravi Zacharias. Dr. Ravi Zacharias, one of the coolest, smartest guys you'll ever hear. You need to look him up on YouTube. If you haven't, listen to his podcast. Just do whatever you can to get his books in your hands, because they're just great. But he references this story by Nietzsche, who revolved around a madman who jumps into this crowd and starts causing a stir by sort of asking, "Okay, where's God? What's happened to God?" And everybody starts laughing at him. And then there's this quote that Nietzsche has in the story, and I'll just read it here. Quote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have all killed him. How shall we console ourselves, the most murderous of all murderers? The holiest and the mightiest that the world has hitherto possessed has bled to death under our knife. Who will wipe the blood from us? With what water could we cleanse ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to devise? Is not the magnitude of this deed too great for us? Shall we not ourselves have to become gods merely to seem worthy of it?" And I read that because that really struck me. I mean, this was a guy that sort of coined the phrase "God is dead." This was the guy who was behind a lot of the darkest philosophies of our time. But even he realized that if you get rid of the concept of God, you can't just leave it like that. You can't have that vacuum there. There has to be some form of replacement for God. Even if that means that we have to become God to take over, right? Because he says, we've killed God, but now basically we have to become God just to make up for what we've done. Because what do you do then? Where's your frame of reference? How do you trust reason? How do you find morality? How do you reach these conclusions that you can only reach with the assumption that there's a God? And so I feel like this whole, redefining morality thing just kind of seems like an attempt to become God, don't you?
Oh, yeah. Because, like you said, like Nietzsche said, I want to just mention here that Nietzsche had just an awesome mustache. And if you have not seen his mustache, you should really go to Wikipedia or, look up a picture of that guy, because, wow, it was just awesome. But I digress.
Well, that's dangerous territory right now, because did you see the article this week that, Netflix put out this, basically... They put out this, I don't remember if it was on Twitter or where it was, but they basically were telling people to stop ogling Ted Bundy, the actor who's playing Ted Bundy in their new documentary series.
That. Yes.
It's pretty messed up. Let's see if we could, I guess, we can't really impose our morality on other people, but I'm just going to go on the record saying I don't think Ted Bundy or Nietzsche were really decent people. So anyway, admire the mustache away, but keep that in mind.
I do. Karl Marx, you got to respect his beard. It was really wild and huge too. He may have had just a font of terrible ideas, but his beard was, I think, enviable. But,
I share your affinity for facial hair, for awesome facial hair. So I'll definitely take it under advisement.
But it's really interesting. So it's like, so Netflix is telling fans, like, hey, stop expressing that you feel attracted to this actor playing Ted Bundy. That's nasty. You shouldn't feel that way.
We're stretching reality with the real headlines these days.
Yeah, really? I know. Who would have guessed, 20 years ago that you'd have a company having to tell people to stop ogling Ted Bundy? Anyway, but again, where does Netflix get off telling people that they shouldn't be attracted to Ted Bundy? What is the basis of their morality in saying you shouldn't feel this way, saying you should not admire this guy, you shouldn't envy this guy? They are, at that point when you say that, you are setting up this objective morality, you are setting up this idea of sin. You're saying, hey, Ted Bundy is an objectively bad dude, and everybody should recognize him as a bad dude, and if you don't recognize him as a bad dude, it's not okay. You're doing it wrong. And that really is isn't that what sin is? Isn't that the whole idea behind sin?
Well, right. And if you ever argue with folks on this, if you ever, I've debated some folks casually about this kind of thing, about morality outside of God. And typically the more snide responses you get go something like this. Well, if you need God and a fear of hell to tell you that murder is wrong, then I just don't know what to say. You're a terrible person. That's kind of the tone that comes out of it, right? But that's not really an answer.
No,
it doesn't explain.
It doesn't explain
why. Right. It doesn't explain why everyone should know that murder is wrong. It doesn't explain why. And even if you listen to some of the great thinkers, they'll dodge the question. Richard Dawkins, Very, very smart guy. Wrote The God Delusion. Was a very, very vociferous atheist, but he sort of stumbles on the morality question and says, well, I think it's, due to, trying to minimize pain and trying to, he just sort of dances around it without really making a strong case. Why would you want to do that?
Do animals in the wild try to minimize pain? When a cat eats a bird, does it try to minimize the bird's pain? That's not part of nature.
Right. Well, right. So and let's remember that, if we're talking about what Nietzsche had to say about it, this guy was not by any means a theist. This was a guy who, again, coined the phrase "God is dead." But another concept that he came up with, interestingly, was the Übermensch. Like he was the first guy to really popularize the idea of Superman. And I think that sort of naturally leads into, what are our society's attempts to, sort of recreate God without actual concept of God involved. And there's been a lot of those. I think there's some sci-fi references you were talking to me about earlier this week that I thought were really interesting in that regard, Josh.
Oh yeah, I just think it's fascinating the ubiquity of this idea in science fiction of the godlike aliens. There's basically two different ways this idea comes up in sci-fi. One is that the aliens are already godlike and they are acting as gods to humanity. And the other is that humanity itself will become God. And both of those ideas are explored in one of the most famous science fiction works of all time, which is 2001: A Space Odyssey. The famous movie by Stanley Kubrick, and also the famous book by Arthur C. Clarke, upon which the movie was based. And so in 2001: A Space Odyssey, you have these godlike aliens who come down to Earth approximately 3 million years ago. Of course, the theory of evolution is constantly being updated. So back when this was written 50 years ago, 3 million years seemed like the time they thought was right for humanity to emerge from apehood. But of course, that's different now. I think it's more like 8 million years now, but whatever. So in the story, these godlike aliens descend from the heavens, like gods, and they basically impart humanity onto apes. They find some apes, and they modify their brains, modify their genes, and make them into people. And then these same godlike aliens, after they've done this, they basically devise a test. Without going into detail about it, they devise a test for the humans to pass. And if the humans eventually ascend to a place where they're able to pass this test, then they will be given the next step in evolution, which is to become godlike themselves. And the story ends with the protagonist, David Bowman, being transformed into what is called the Star Child, which is basically a god. So
I really wish his name had been David Bowie.
I'm sorry to spy. I don't think David Bowie was actually famous at that time. I'm not sure when his career, when he became famous. But
I'm just saying, if you had a character named David Bowie who went on to become a star child, anyway, go ahead.
No, but so that's just one of your most famous science fiction stories of all time, and it's all about gods who are of course aliens, but it's all about gods essentially creating humanity. And then humanity ascending to become godlike itself. And Arthur C. Clarke, of course, was an atheist, as are virtually all science fiction writers. That's a very heavily atheistic community and profession.
Yeah, we ought to change that.
I would love to.
You know what? Let's do that. Let's recruit some Christian sci-fi writers, or at least some faith-based sci-fi, and see which way we can go with that. That'd be pretty cool.
Well, there is some. We'll talk about that in a future episode.
Oh yeah,
that sounds like a good episode.
More.
Yeah, but that is just it's ubiquitous, and that idea runs through all sorts of different science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke had another story which is not a very famous one, but I found it really fascinating. It was called The Light of Other Days. Arthur C. Clarke wrote that with Stephen Baxter shortly before his death. I think it might have been Clarke's last novel. But to cut a long story short, in the light of other days, humanity discovers time travel. Except time travel only works by being able to observe the past. You can't actually travel in time. You can only look back into the past and see what was there. And by the end of the book, this has evolved into this technology where they're able to actually scan the DNA and the brains of all the people who have died in the past using this time travel technology. It's like they can go back and scan the brain of Caesar and scan his DNA before he was assassinated, and then they're able to then recreate him in the present. And the book ends on this idea that they're going to have a resurrection of the dead. They're going to use this time travel scanning technology to resurrect everybody who has ever died, and they're going to have heaven using science.
Well, that's kind of creepy and awesome at the same time.
Yeah, it was very interesting. But I was just fascinated by it. So again, Clarke being this famous science fiction author, this famous atheist, all through his books are these ideas of godhood, of people either being influenced by gods or becoming gods themselves. I just find it fascinating how that is such a common idea. It's like unavoidable. It's like people can't stop thinking about these ideas, no matter, even if they disavow, what we think of as traditional religion. If they disavow Christianity, they still can't get over the idea there must be some sort of a transcendence, something bigger than what we are, that directs our destinies and gives us meaning.
Well, right, and then I think the modern application of those as well. When, of course, looking at what's popular now, you can look at the superhero genre, right? And you got a whole laundry list of very popular characters, these kind of pop culture characters that are sort of godlike, right? Which is really interesting for a lot of reasons. Some of them actually are, mythological gods. You got Thor in there. That's wasn't really that subtle, right? But you also have the Will Smith movie Hancock. That was great, where superheroes and angels, the line between those was sort of blurred. Wonder Woman's got some old mythology thrown into there as well, sort of god powers and whatnot. Then I would argue that Superman himself is actually very, very much a kind of a god metaphor.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So I think that the superhero genre has a lot of this. But what's interesting to me is that again, I don't think they're just there for the powers. Okay, it would be really cool to fly. It would be really well. Okay, actually, if you're a fan of Because Science with Kyle Hill, which is a YouTube series, I think I've mentioned on here before, but you should really look him up if you have the chance. He does a lot of why you wouldn't want different superpowers, and it's really interesting. He did one on Flight not too long ago, talking about the complications that you would actually have if you did have the power of flight. Anyway, superheroes have superpowers, which is incidentally why Batman is not one. But I knew I'd get you with that one. So superheroes have superpowers, but that's not really why we want to read about them, right? Because supervillains have superpowers too, and there's all sorts of morally neutral or morally bad characters that we don't see as superheroes, and they might be interesting in some capacity in the way that a crime documentary is interesting, but that's not what people have a hunger for. I don't think you can subtract the moral element from superheroes and still have an intriguing heroic character. I just don't think you can. Now, that's not to say that heroes are not and should not be flawed, because that's what makes a character interesting, right? So you can have flaws, and you can have moral struggle, and you can even have moral shortcomings in a heroic character. But an amoral hero, I don't think you can do that. Those things don't go together, and so it's just really interesting in the human psyche. I don't know if we're able to really divorce that moral element from what we want to idolize, from what we want to create as our own sort of gods. And it's just really interesting to me to see how that's sort of coming about in modern pop culture, to sort of see the direction that's taken. We're creating our own modern mythology is really what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and there have been various movies and various comic characters where the hero is amoral, where he's not heroic, and the moral conflict there is murky. But those are never the popular ones. You'll notice those aren't the ones that become the billion-dollar hit movies. The heroes' stories that people really hunger for are those ones that present a very clear distinction between good and evil, and between characters whose actions are heroic and characters whose actions are villainous. And that's the kind of story that really grabs people's attentions and imagination. And I think, like you said, that's for the same reason. I think that the idea of the godlike aliens is ubiquitous in sci-fi, is because people just instinctively feel a need for this sort of setup in their universe. They feel the need for this sort of moral clarity, this sort of moral paradigm to understand their own lives. And for better or worse, superhero movies, I think, have become a source of that, a way to fulfill that longing people have.
Well, right. And if you go back to that Nietzsche story, that is just a really interesting piece. He actually discusses that as well, talking about how, now that we've killed God, doesn't it seem like everything is out of control? Who's where is the world still spinning? Are we still in a recognizable reality? It's just really interesting, the symbolism and the pictures that are used there. But I think it raises an important question, which is, in the absence of God, if we don't just get to create our own gods and our own morality, then how do we orient ourselves to reality? Like, how do we make sense of the world around us? Now, sure, in the physical realm, we can look to science, and but then you got this really fuzzy line where science crosses into more conceptual realms, whether you're going toward philosophy or mathematics. Mathematics is entirely conceptual. And you don't get to observe. I mean, you can observe markers for mathematics, but your concepts of that stand independent, right? And so I think you have to assume a whole lot of things about reason itself, and that's what gets really trippy when you get into the debate about whether God exists. Because if God doesn't exist, can you really even trust your reason? I mean, what are the assumptions that go into how you determine things? That's where it gets really murky. And if we're talking about sin, then how do you determine what's good or bad without a concept of God, without some sort of external first cause? How do you do that? Is it just happiness? A lot of people will agree that happiness is good, but why? Why is happiness good? How do you know that happiness is good? It feels good, but is that a reason for it to be good? Are all things that feel good actually good? I mean, this raises a whole lot of questions that most people don't ask, and that's the problem, I would love to meet Julia that wrote this article one day. I'd love to ask her some of these questions, like, how did you come to these conclusions? How did you find, after rejecting the morality that you grew up with and the faith that you grew up with, how did you come to the conclusion that empathy is always good? How did you reach that conclusion? Is it really just, what brings the most pleasure or avoids the most pain for yourself or for society? Well, that's just utilitarianism, right? There's nothing novel about that. People have been doing that forever. So where do you find meaning? How do you answer the question of purpose? Can you do these things without religion? Can you do them without a concept of God? And I don't want to mingle those things too closely, right? Because you can have God without religion. You can have religion without God.
Yes. I mean, Buddhism would be the obvious example of a religion without God. Buddhists don't have a particular God, but they do have very definitive ideas about the purpose and nature of the universe and man's relationship to it, which is what makes it religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. And a lot of these questions are just sort of seem to be ignored by this flippant sort of DIY faith that people just sort of come up with, right? Yeah. And by the way, this is not limited to atheists. I hear similar things said within the church where I hear people talk about, well, my God does this, my God does that, or, this is what I think Jesus would do. And it's sort of independent of any verification or any support at all. It's just sort of, well, I have a feeling that this is what's good, so I'm just sort of going to line God up behind it and say so. And so it's just a really interesting question, and to tie it back to the beginning of the episode, this informs all of the things that we think about and do, and there's not, there's so rare that there's an opportunity to sort of deep dive into this sort of thing, but it's a really interesting topic, and it's something that we want to hear from you about as well. I mean, does eliminating the concept of sin sort of make people righteous by default? I mean, what do you think of that? What was written in the article there? And then, can you reach objective morality without invoking God? Have you heard a convincing case on that? If so, share it with us. If you're someone who does reject religion, you consider yourself an atheist or skeptic or whatever, we want to hear from you. So make sure you join the conversation this week on social media. We'll be throwing up some questions. We'll be throwing up the show notes. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/TheCI Show and on Twitter at The CI Show. Also, make sure you find the podcast on Google Play and iTunes. That's all for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. For Joel Kurtnitis and Josh Hugo, have a great week, and thanks for listening to Constructive Interference.